Feels a little weird to say good morning to you since I already spoke to you, but good morning, church. How are we today? Good to hear. So, hey, welcome. We're right in the middle of a series called This I Believe, and what we're doing for these few weeks is we're working through some of the basic tenets, some of the basic beliefs of the Christian faith. And if you were here the last couple of weeks or maybe online, we've discussed our belief in God, like just a foundational belief in God, our belief of the Bible as His Word. And today we're going to get into a topic that sometimes can be a little bit more dicey, can maybe even get a little heated sometimes in Christian circles, and this is this idea of life after death. Does life after death exist? And more importantly than just that question, does it matter how we live our lives right now? Does it matter how we live our lives right now? And, as you walk through all different kinds of faith traditions and ideas, you could run across a ton of different ideas on this subject. Everything from we just stop existing, we just stop existing, to people who think that the spirits of the dead roam the earth as ghosts and make appearances and interact and influence living people, and all the way to reincarnation, which actually, as I think about that one and I watch my dog basically nap in between meals and bedtime, that doesn't seem like too bad of an idea. Anyway, there's a ton of different ideas that people grasp onto. Some do it as a way to deal with the sudden departure of a loved one, and there's comfort in thinking that that person is looking down and maybe having some interaction in our lives, some influence in our lives, and again, it's comforting, right? Like I said a minute ago, as we talk about this thing, it can get contentious in the world of Christianity. Just for an example of some of the things that we deal with, there's one of Paul's letters, 2 Thessalonians, right? This is his letter to this church at Thessalonica. He wrote this to him early in the letter. He said, "These will pay the penalty of eternal destruction from the Lord's presence and from His glorious strength." The question that comes up here is this idea, what does the term eternal destruction mean? Right? For some people, it means that, you're talking about eternity, this eternal conscious torment thing, where these people are this is the burning in hell for eternity, and every day it's just day after day after day after day of torment, right? So some people say that's what it means. Other people will say, well, no, that's not what it means. It means that at some point they're going to be destroyed for eternity. This idea of annihilationism. At some point, God's just going to take all these people and completely wipe them out as if they never existed. And people will go through those arguments on both sides of what that means. And you get into all these different debates and arguments, and you kind of wonder, okay, so which side is it? Which one's right? Back in 2011, there was a prominent pastor in Michigan, a guy named Rob Bell. And Bell wrote this book called Love Wins. Love Wins. And it was very popular. It gained a lot of attention. It got him an appearance on Oprah. But the book was very problematic. It had a problematic take on heaven and hell. And it caused a lot of division and argument within the Christian world. And Bell ended up resigning from his church, and he went on to do other things. Through the course of this, there was another pastor, a guy named John Piper. And Piper's from Minnesota, and he tweeted this out. And he just said, it's kind of savage, but he just said, "Farewell, Rob Bell." That was his response to Bell's new book, "Farewell, Rob Bell." Francis Chan, in response to this whole thing, wrote a book called Erasing Hell. And he went through all these different reasons as to why Bell was wrong. He went through it and corrected all these claims. So this is just one issue that we can see, one example of this issue that we can see, but it's not hopeless, right? We may not have every small detail that we want, but God's not at all ambiguous when it comes to something as important as what takes place when we die. Now, He doesn't leave out any uncertainty as to whether or not there's a life to come. And so what we're going to do today, we're going to dig into a passage from one of Paul's letters to the church at Corinth. This church at Corinth. And as we talk about this, it's important to keep in mind here that Paul and these other church leaders, they spent a lot of time answering questions and clearing up confusion. Especially when it came to these Gentile believers. You might have heard the word Gentile before. Gentile just means non-Jewish. So that's like you and me. We'd be considered Gentiles. We're not Jewish, right? And so he takes a lot of time to try and clear these issues up, because you have to remember, these early Christians, they didn't have the Bible, right? They didn't have the Bible. There was no the Bible for these guys to go read. You couldn't say, hey, we do this because they said so in the Bible. They looked at you crazy. What's the Bible? There was no such thing as a Bible at that time. And so for these Gentiles, these non-Jews living in a place like Corinth, it's very likely their understanding, their knowledge of Jews is really limited. Because for the most part, the Jewish people, they were just kind of moved around by the empire into these cities. Rome conquered them, they'd take them, they'd move them out. And all these people in Corinth would know is it's just these weird people who followed one God. Who does that? Who follows just one God? Right? And these people just seem to argue all the time about stuff. Life after death was a big question. Right? Greek and Roman philosophers had their views, and different faith systems, different cults. They had their views. In fact, within Judaism, within the Jewish people, there were different sects that had their own different views. And so when you have a large town like Corinth, right, you have this really diverse population, and people were likely just taking and combining beliefs and traditions from all these different places, and really, they just made a big mess. And now you have these young believers, right, and all this crazy amount of like religious and cultural and cultic backgrounds, and on top of that, you had the resurrection of Jesus. So there's all these questions. So is there life after death? And if so, so what? So what? What does that have to do with my life right now? If there's a life after death, who cares? What does that have to do with my life right now? Maybe you're like me. Maybe you're a little bit like me. In fact, I think I know this about a lot of us, right? We have more than enough to deal with at the present moment. We have more than enough to deal with. Like, we're sitting here thinking, man, are the kids going to be sent home from school? What am I going to do with these kids for 14 days? Right? In my job, it's kind of maybe precarious at the moment, and maybe I'm a small business owner. I'm wondering, hey, am I ever going to make money again? Am I going to be able to reopen? Right? We have a million things going on in our lives. Why in the world do I care about life after death? Like, seriously, I'll just worry about it when I get old. Right? Or maybe I'll figure it all out once I retire, or maybe when the kids go off to college and the house is empty for a little while, I can think about it then, or when things get back to right and to normal, or maybe sometime, right? But we can't do that. We can't do that. Paul's going to tell these brand new Christians at Corinth, he says, you can't do that. You can't do that because we don't have a lot of time. We can't do that because we don't have a lot of time. So as we unpack here what Paul wrote to the Corinthian people, and as we read this, as we get into 2 Corinthians here, I want to remind you of this. It's very important. We have to keep in mind, Paul is writing to Christians. Right? This is a letter to instruct people who follow Jesus, right? He's talking directly to the church. In proper church lingo, we would say he's talking to saved people, right? People going to heaven. And he writes this to him. He says, now, we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. So if our earthly tent, have you ever camped in a tent? Anybody ever camped in a tent? Yeah, you ever camp in a tent in the rain? Right, I can remember camping as a kid, right? And after a few days, it seemed like Labor Day always rained. Anytime we went camping on Labor Day, it always rained. And it was really cool for the first few nights, but then after a while, it just kind of started to lose its luster. Right? And I don't think you've ever really tent camped until you've camped with dogs. And you've had dogs in the tent, and somehow they managed to knock over the tent in the middle of the night, in the middle of a storm. And then they lay against the tent. If you know anything about tents, when it rains and you lay against it, water comes in, and then puddles get in there, right? And so you got the dogs laying against the tent, and then you're sharing an air mattress with your jerk younger brother, right? And your brother decides here in the middle of the night, he pushes you out of the air mattress. Now you're sleeping in the puddle of water next to the dogs who've knocked over the tent while it's still raining. Have I adequately described 2020 well enough for you all? Right? Our life here is just temporary, right? And it can be fragile because tents are not made to last forever. So we're going along and we're in our tent, right? And the world just starts throwing stuff at us. And pretty soon it's like stress. And then we've got strife and work and kids and everything just keeps going. And life just beats on us. And it's body shot after body shot. And you're stuck there wondering, you're like, when's the knockout coming? When's the knockout coming? Because the doctor is just bad report after bad report. And the relationship won't get any better. And the job just keeps getting worse. And I can't find one. And I don't know what I'm going to do. And pretty soon, as life just keeps beating on our tent, it just keeps looking worse and worse and worse. And then we're sitting there, we're like, this is my hope? This is my hope for the rest of my life, this beat up, frail tent? That's what I'm putting my hope in? And what if this tent, right, this beat up old tent, what if it's the best it's ever going to be? Right? What if this tent's the end of our existence? That's it? That's the end of our existence is this tent? This body that's just going to shrivel up and waste away, I'm going to put my final hope in that? I mean, is it any wonder that we see people choose to end their own lives, to abuse drugs, to find ways to cope, when your sole hope for the future is put into a tent that can be so easily destroyed? And so I know for a lot of us, and we're sitting out there like, okay, so what is our hope? Where is our hope? If the tent isn't our hope, where's our hope? Paul, you're so smart. Where's my hope at? Here's what we got to do. right? Don't hope in the tent that's going to be destroyed. Don't count on the body that'll rot away from the inside out. Don't count on any of it because we have something so much better. He said we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. You think about that. We have a building, a home, a refuge. It's given to us by God. It's built by God. I mean, you think this world is impressive if you've been up the last couple mornings and seen the sun come up and the colors of the sun sets and all the red from the wildfires and everything, and you look at that and you're like, who made these amazing colors? If you think that's impressive, wait till you see what God has waiting for us. Because we have a house, right? We have a house. You think about your house or even this building or something, you compare it to a tent. Right? Think about the protection that a house, a building, it offers. You can lock doors and you can close windows. And the dog can't knock it over, and you can throw your brother out whenever you want. And it's not just for a short time. Right? Paul says it's eternal. It's without beginning, without end. We don't have a checkout time. No sickness is going to ruin this house. There's no temptation that's going to lead us astray and cause us to damage and destroy our own home. Because it's a house that's built by the hands of God. Is anybody else excited about this? Come on, amen. You ever seen what a home can do for a family without one? If you've ever witnessed this, it's amazing. I've been blessed to travel to Haiti a number of times, and we've had the opportunity to go in and build homes for people who are sleeping in the dirt. And here's the amazing thing. When they move from that tent, and they move from that dirt floor into a home, right? This is a solid, just simple concrete building. When they move into that, life changes. Because now they have security. They can lock the doors when they leave. They can lock the doors when they go to sleep. Their health improves, right? There's less chances of getting sick when you're not sleeping down in the mud and the water and the waste. Right? This tent is weak. It's sickly. It's a temporary place. And we believe in life after death. We believe that the life to come is eternal. It's strong. It's a fortress. It's not built by human hands. It's not corrupted by sin. It's not fragile. I think Paul had in mind here something Jesus once said. Right, Jesus told a large group of people, he said, hey, store up your treasures in heaven. Store up your treasures in heaven. Don't plan on this life. Don't plan on this earth as being the best there's ever going to be. We want to store our treasures. We want to put our hope and all of our striving, all of our planning into the next life, right, into that eternal house, because if our hope and our focus is there, our heart is going to follow. Our life will be changed. Our focus, our desires will be changed. And I'm sure most of us, if we've spent any time in church, right, we know, we can tell, we can say what happens to treasures that are stored in a tent. They rot, they get stolen. As the man said, he said, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. Right, we believe in life after death. This fragile tent is not the end. This fragile tent is not the end. And Paul keeps going here, right? He starts in with verse 2. He says, meanwhile, so while our tent is being destroyed, while sickness, war, and famine rage, and while cities burn and jobs are lost and bills don't quit and cars break down and knees break down and they start making funny noises and kids get off the rails and basically 2020 just keeps happening, right? He says, meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed with our heavenly dwelling. Because when we are clothed, we will not be found naked. For while we are in this tent, we groan and are burdened because we do not wish to be unclothed, but to be clothed with our heavenly dwelling, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. So while all this is going on, while all this is happening around us, we groan for the next life. Right? We had this desire, this longing to be in the presence of our Creator, and it's from the very beginning. Go back to the Garden of Eden. Right? We were created to walk with God, to be in community with Him. But then sin happened and we were separated, and now we have this longing for God, and it causes us to groan. It causes us to groan. We can go so far as to say, right, death seems so unnatural for us because we were not made to experience death. We were not created to experience death, right? We were created to spend eternity with our Creator. We were created to do that. And sin caused a curse. It causes separation. And now we know that we're reconciled with God because of Jesus' sacrifice, and we get to experience a victory over death only because Jesus was resurrected and he paved the way for us. But we still have to experience death. Paul wrote a letter to a group of churches in an area known as Galatia. And in the course of that letter, he made this comment. He said, I've been crucified with Christ. I've been crucified with Christ. And there's a lot of implications to that. He's not only saying that, hey, I've died to myself, and I'm going to live out the rest of my life for Jesus. He's definitely saying that. But there's a whole lot more to it that's implied by what he said here. He says we literally have to go through and experience death just like Jesus did. Jesus rose from the grave, right? He died and rose from the grave and was resurrected. Here's the deal. We are going to die. But in just the same way, we're going to be resurrected from the grave in the presence of God. There is life after death. It's demonstrated by our yearning, by our longing, our groaning, and all of creation groans for that day, for the new heavens and the new earth. But in the meanwhile, right, we feel naked and we feel vulnerable and we fear things happening that we can't control. And we wonder things like, when there's a run on food at the grocery store and no more is being delivered, what are we going to do? And what are we going to do when violence increases and it spreads? How do we take care of ourselves and protect our families? And this causes fear and anxiety because here's the deal. We know we're created not to be clothed with earthly and temporary comfort or dwelling, but we want to be clothed with our heavenly, our eternal dwelling. And what's really cool at the end of this passage here, it's probably my favorite part of all 10 verses, right? Into verse 4, he writes this. He just sneaks this little thing in. He says, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. So that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. And you look at that word mortal, and that's a common word, right? And basically just means it's something that will die. It's something that has an end to it. In fact, one definition says it's liable to death. Mortal is liable to death. It owes to death. And so we think about our bodies as mortal. We think of them as mortal. Sometimes for a lot of us, just getting up in the morning, it makes us realize how mortal our bodies are. But along with our bodies, you know what else is mortal? What else is mortal is this world and all of its problems. Death itself is mortal. It has an end. For the follower of Jesus, death is only here for a short time. And sickness and strife and heartbreak and all that stuff is mortal. It's liable to death. It's going to end. And so that thing that just seems so huge today, that thing that you can just never get past, that's going to go with you forever, the death that you don't understand, the diagnosis that won't stop, it's all mortal. It has an end. But in the meantime, we long to be clothed. Back up a moment, right? We long for our heavenly house because we know that those things that are mortal, they're going to be swallowed up by life. They're going to be swallowed up by life. And the cool thing about that word, that little phrase, swallowed by life, at the root of it, it can be used in discussing things that are eternal as well as things that are temporary here and now. Some of those bad things can be swallowed up by life here and now. And so we long for those things that are dead to be swallowed up. For the addict, it may be freedom from whatever the addiction is. For the oppressed, the trafficked person, it may be life outside of modern-day slavery. We long for life in Jesus to swallow up the bad. And it can happen right now. Freedom is a possibility. Eternity for the believer starts the moment they die to themselves and are converted to followers of Jesus. We long for life that will kill death. We long for something better in the next life. We long for new heavens and new earth. And I believe in life after death, so I long for a new life. I think the next natural thing to say, though, is why? Why the longing? Why do we feel this way? Why do we feel this way? And we continue on. Paul gives us an answer here. He says this. He says, now it is God who has made us for this very purpose and has given us the Spirit as a deposit guaranteeing what is to come. Therefore, we are always confident and know that as long as we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. We live by faith and not by sight. We are confident, I say, and would prefer to be away from the body and at home with the Lord. Right off the bat here in verse 5, right, Paul tells us, he says, God made us for something. He made us for something. He made us for a purpose. What's that purpose, right? We have to be able to answer that question. We have to know what was the purpose that God made us for. Because he made each and every one of us. We'll have different callings, but he made each and every one of us with a purpose, the same purpose, and that is to dwell with him. Right? Again, I'll take you back to the garden, back to Genesis. We were created to be in relationship with God. That was the whole purpose for God creating man, was for that relationship. But again, the sin on our part, it got in the way, and it put a barrier between us. And that barrier was bridged by God through Jesus. And see, Paul gets that. He's kind of saying it again. He gets that. He understands the purpose. He understands the cure. He also knows that we have to get through this life and we'll experience death, each and every one of us. And we'll pause here for just a second. I know, and some of you may be thinking this, I know we have to consider the second coming of Jesus. And at some point there will be people, possibly us, that will be alive at that moment, right? But right now, where we sit in history and time and space, there's only been two people that have ever lived that have not experienced death. And that's Enoch and Elijah from the Old Testament, right? So odds would tell us of the billions and billions and billions and billions of people that have ever lived throughout history, there's two that have never experienced death. So barring that second coming, I say with pretty high confidence, each one of us will experience death. But here's the good thing, right? God did not leave us empty-handed. He didn't just say, hey, best of luck. Best of luck, right? God didn't just leave us out on our own. He left us the Spirit. And when you see Spirit there, that's not just any Spirit, right? This is the Spirit that raised Jesus from the grave, that walked in and told him to get up. This is the same Spirit that gave the apostles the boldness and the courage, the ability to preach on Pentecost. That's the Spirit he left us. The Spirit that guided Paul all his life. The same Spirit that prevented Paul from going to certain places. God left us this active living person as a helper to get through life. Paul calls it a deposit, right? It's a surety guarantee. For those of us that have had a little bit of firsthand experience with the legal system, we could call it a cash bond. The Spirit that lives in us testifies. It provides assurance. It guarantees that Jesus is coming back. And so we know we were made to be in relation with God, right? Jesus completed this rescue mission, and the Spirit was left to provide us with this guarantee that this beat-up old tent was not the end. And as he goes on, he says, therefore, and you want to know what is the therefore? And it's because we know that we have that purpose, we have the assurance, we're confident that while we're here in this tent, we know that we're apart from God. And yes, we're apart, but we would prefer to be away from the body and at home with the Lord. That's our preference. Because he made us that way, right? I believe there's life after death because we have been intentionally made to long to be in the presence of God. Right? We were made this way. We were created for it. And Paul used this passage to convey to his audience. Right? This church in Corinth, it was full of new believers, full of Gentiles, maybe some Jews, but he used this passage to show them that life after death was a reality, that it was something they can have faith in. So yeah, I believe in life after death. I believe in life after death because I believe this fragile tent is not the end. There's something better. Because I believe that there's a longing in me and in you for a new life. Because I believe that God intentionally created us to be in his presence eternally. And he gave us that Spirit as a guarantee. These are all great reasons for these people living there and for us to reject any afterlife belief, theory, doctrine that says otherwise. What Paul is giving us here is a true path of freedom from the bondage of this earth, from the bondage of the world. That is just this measly tent. God has so much more to offer. Amen? Amen. Now, you might have noticed, you might have been thinking as we've gone through the course this morning, that we haven't at all touched on like eternal destination and heaven and hell and all that stuff and what happens, what really happens in life after death. And that's a really important discussion, right? And Jesus and the New Testament writers, they have a lot to say on the subject. But it's not the discussion that we're having today. Except, we do have to deal with something, except the way Paul ends this passage forces us to have a bit of discussion of what happens in the next life. And if we look at verses 9 and 10, he ends this little section, this passage, It says, so we make it our goal to please him, whether we are at home in the body or away from it. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive what is due him for the things done while in the body, whether good or bad. One key to understanding what Paul's trying to get across here is to remember he's writing to Christians. He's writing to believers. He's writing to the church. And we should know that those outside the church, they'll have their dealings with God. And there's plenty throughout the New Testament, Old Testament, there's plenty of places where it discusses God's dealings with people outside the faith. But here, right now, Paul is talking directly to the church, to Christians. And there are all kinds of thoughts as to what this means and what it really looks like. And we could go on for hours with tiny details and guesses and assumptions about these verses. But very simply, what Paul is telling this church, he's saying, hey, your conduct, what you do in this life, it matters. What you do in this life, it matters. Jesus is concerned about the way we conduct ourselves in this life and how we live in this world. And you can think about it this way, right? We have this relationship with God, this vertical relationship, right? We're down here, God's up here. We had this vertical relationship with him. And under the new covenant, under the covenant made by Jesus through his death and resurrection, right? The way we live now, we demonstrate how we feel about God. We demonstrate our vertical relationship with God by the way we love and treat others, this horizontal relationship we have with others. Our vertical relationship with God is demonstrated by our horizontal relationship with other people. The way we interact with the world around us shows us how we feel about God. And we know that because Jesus gave us the greatest commandment. Right? We know the greatest commandment, right? Love God, love people. Love God, love people. Those two things are inseparable. If you remember back to the story, Jesus was asked by a really smart guy. He said, what's the greatest commandment? Of all these 600 and some odd commandments that the law gives us, what's the greatest one? And Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. This is the first and greatest commandment. And then, unprompted, he just adds this on, right? It's important that he said this. He followed it up. He said, the second is just like it. And you can think of second there. He didn't say, the next law or the, kind of, basically what he's saying there is furthermore, love your neighbor as yourself. All of the law and prophets hang on these two commandments. So we need to understand and we need to come to grips with the idea that we can live a life, we can avoid all of the sinful temptations, right? All the fleshly temptations and do all the right things and take communion and go to church. But if we act like a jerk and we mistreat people, we are missing it. We are not at all in line with God's will. And it's fair to note, it's fair to say that, you can love the daylights out of people. You can love the daylights out of people, but if we have not surrendered our lives to Jesus and we just show up to church but don't live lives based on his teaching, the New Testament writings, well, then we're not better off eternally than someone who's just a nice guy or a nice lady. He says, love God, love people. Those two things can't be separated. If you're loving God, you're loving people. If you're loving people, you're loving God. It's a both-and thing. It's not optional for us. And so as we start to add this up and bring this around, right, Jesus has a lot to say about the way we as his followers treat one another. We see this all throughout the New Testament writings. And if we believe in an afterlife, right, if we're willing to say, hey, you know what, I believe what Paul wrote here under the inspiration of God. I believe what he laid out as there being an afterlife. If I'm going to believe verses 1 through 8, then I have to believe verses 9 and 10 that our actions matter to Jesus. And so as we circle back around here, right, Jesus caring about the way we love others, then we can confidently say when we stand in front of him, when we answer to how we treat, we're going to have to answer to how we treat other people. Which leads us to this. It's a small, inescapable truth. And it's this, it's that how you live your life today says more about what you believe about life after death than any words you will ever say. How you live your life today says more about what you believe about life after death than any words you will ever say. If you want to narrow that down and get it a little simpler, basically saying, hey, talk is cheap. Talk is cheap. Because if you're at work or if you're at school or you're hanging out with friends or you're hanging out with neighbors and in your neighborhood and you say, hey, I went to church, I had this great weekend at church, and they give you a look like this, man, you might want to rethink how you show yourself to other people. Right? For those of us on social media, maybe you want to rethink how you show yourselves. Because if you've ever felt the need to include in a post the fact that you're a Christian, that might be a problem. Or if you post something and you don't feel comfortable including the fact that you're a Christian, that's a problem. And it may sound a little bit corny, but it's really relevant, right? Do you really want to sit with Jesus and go through your social media feed? And we need to ask ourselves, right? Are we mean-spirited and calling people names? Are we gossiping and spreading lies and slandering people? And even outside from behind the keyboard, are we nasty and unloving and harsh with people? Do we live lives filled with sinful activities that go against what we claim to believe? I got to ask myself every day, does my life testify to my spoken claims of surrender to Jesus? Each morning in the mirror, does my life testify to my spoken claims of my surrender to Jesus? And these questions go on and on. These are great questions to ask ourselves. Do I hate other people because they look or think differently than me? Right? What do I want to tell Jesus about the way I treated the people he made and that he loves? What actions of mine do I want to discuss with him? So I don't want people looking at me like that last picture, right? When I say I go to church, I don't want Jesus looking at me like that. Here's the reaction I want. Right? I want people to look at me and say, you know what? Of course you go to church. Of course you're a follower of Jesus. You don't even have to tell me. You don't even have to tell me. Right? We should be able to get through difficult situations without making Jesus look bad. Because remember, right? Remember, all these things, they're all mortal. They're all going to die away. They're all going to die away. So you know what? People's souls are more important than elections. We should care more about winning people to Christ than winning an argument over things that are going to die. You will tell people more about who you are by your actions than your words. I once heard someone say, when people constantly show you who they are, believe them. When people constantly show you who they are, believe them. We want to show people that we possess a faith that leads to a peace that defies understanding. And we want to show people that we're a people of hope in the midst of hopelessness. And we want to show people that we're a people who believe in God's righteousness, His holiness, and His justice. We want to constantly be showing the world that we're a people that believe in a life to come that is far better than this one. So yeah, we believe in life after death. So let's go live like it.